Good afternoon, everyone. With apologies for our getting started late and gratitude for the fact that you're still in your seats. I'm Glenn Lowry, Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences here at Brown and Professor of Economics and a Faculty Fellow at the Watson Institute, and I welcome you to this first of the year of Watson's Distinguished Lecture Series. Before I say anything further, I'm obliged to read the following announcement. In the event of a fire alarm, please proceed calmly to a nearby exit. Leave the building and move away from the doorway. Please note the location of nearby exits. The closest exit may not be where you entered. Be aware that the way you entered may not be the most direct way out. Sitting or standing in the aisles and doorways is not permitted. Smoking is not allowed inside any university building. Please turn off or silence all pagers and cell phones. That having been said, let's get down to business. It is my pleasure to welcome you all for, as I say, this year's inaugural lecture in the Watson Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series. It's going to be delivered by Wole Soyinka under the title, Hatched from the Egg of Impunity, a FOWL called Boko Haram. In addition to the Watson Institute, I wish to acknowledge the financial support for this distinguished lecture from a number of other units on campus, the Kogut Center for the Humanities, the Center for Study of Slavery and Justice, Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, Office of the President of the University, Office of Global Engagement, the Departments of Africana Studies, Anthropology, English, Modern Culture and Media, and Economics. Akinwande Oluwole Soyinka was born in 1934 in Abeokuta, near Ibadan, in western Nigeria. He's a graduate of Government College in Ibadan, and in 1954 he traveled to England to continue his studies at the University of Leeds. He's been a dramaturgist at the Royal Court Theatre in London and has taught drama and literature at various universities in Nigeria, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Throughout his career as a dramatist, he has been an innovator, founding theater groups and even producing and acting in his own plays. Wole Soyinka is a writer of many parts. Over the course of a long, productive career, he has distinguished himself not only as a playwright, but also as a poet, novelist, memoirist, journalist, and cultural critic. He is, simply put, one of the leading men of letters living among us today. Whatever the genre, his writings have invariably reflected a broad and deep knowledge of the classical and modern works of European literary high culture, while at the same time remaining rooted in the mythology of his Yoruba origins. His plays reflect traditions of popular African theater with their combination of dance, music, and action. There's more here, but I want to limit some of what I say by not enumerating the many published works which I have listed in paragraph 4 of my prepared remarks. Let me just note that they are many and varied. In recognition of his literary accomplishments, Wole Soyinka was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature by the Swedish Royal Academy in 1986. But Wole Soyinka is a good deal more than a great and prolific writer. During the Civil War in Nigeria, he was so bold as to appeal in an article for ceasefire. For this, he was arrested in 1967, accused of a treasonous act, conspiring with the Biafra rebels, and was held as a political prisoner for 22 months. Moreover, he has twice been forced into exile from his home country in order to preserve his liberty and his life. Acting with courage, wisdom, and integrity, Wole Soyinka has, for the past half-century, been a leading voice on behalf of the global struggles for justice and human dignity. His dignified bearing, his fierce intelligence, his uncompromising integrity, and his wise moral compass have been a gift not only to his native Nigeria, not merely to his beloved Africa, but to the entire world. To whet your appetites for today's address, just listen to some of Soyinka's words of wisdom as reflected in these oft-repeated quotations drawn from his interviews and writings. The man dies in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny. And for me, justice is the prime condition of humanity. And One's own self-worth is tied to the worth of the community to which one belongs, which is intimately connected to humanity in general. What happens in Darfur becomes an assault on my own community and on me as an individual. That's what the human family is all about. And I don't know any other way to live but to wake up every day armed with my convictions, not yielding them to the threat of danger and to the power and force of people who might despise me. So, without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to be able to introduce Wole Soyinka today as he addresses the theme, Hatched from the Egg of Impunity, a fowl called Boko Haram. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
When next time asked for my CV, can I borrow that? Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back at Brown's on this grimy day. So, hatched from the egg of impunity, a fowl called Boko Haram. Now, here's a digression placed before we have even commenced. It comes in the form of a question directed at prominent sectors of the international media and even the United Nations, whose deliberations I recently watched. What's in a name? Or straight to the point, why Boko Haram? That is not the name that the Nigerian movement of religious irredentists chose for themselves. Mohammed Yusuf and his founding cohorts had settled for the grandiloquent name of Jama'atu at-least Sunnah Leader Awati wal Jihad, meaning people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad. Even if Nigerians found themselves ill-prepared and ill-equipped to cope with this sudden and brutal affliction, they understood and held to the psychological weapon of language. They even refused to concede a shortened version, let's say committed people or whatever. No, they said Boko Haram is what you are, Boko Haram is what your action dictates. Language, we have to understand, is also an instrument of war. So enter the ancillary question, when is a state? I think we could profitably take a cue from the battered humanity of Nigeria, which just simply says, do not concede a thing to the enemy of humanity, certainly not in the common, accessible currency of language. ISIS is not a state, nor is it Islamic. So justly, the conferred name Boko Haram has stuck. So, alas, has the enemy. The humanity of the North has taken the brunt, but all of Nigeria is affected. The populace is still trying to puzzle out how we ever came to such a pass. Unfortunately, many people give scant attention to the intellectual antecedents, ideological antecedents, and evolving, continuing purpose of movements like Boko Haram, especially the descent of religious belief into such brutality. Many cannot even recall the pronouncement of one Sheikh Abubakar Gumi, which went straight to the heart of his Islamic renewal agenda. He said, at one stage, a Christian president for Nigeria, that'll happen over my dead body. Again, it was the same cleric and scholar who blurted out the famous words, Christianity is nothing, a declaration to which I owed the inspiration of one of my public lectures at the University of Ibadan in the late 70s, which I entitled The Credo of Nothing and the being of nothingness. Those who attempt to trace the antecedents of Boko Haram tend to place it at some date that shortchanges actuality, and thus they court the danger of becoming content with just a physical containment of a malaise with deep roots. I shall probably be liable on the same charge, since I have no intention of going all the way back to the beginning of the Wahhabist movement in Saudi Arabia. For our purposes, however, as these involve a colonial enclave that bears the name Nigeria, Sheikh Gumi and his statements are a good timeline as any to begin serious inquiry into the phenomenon. Gumi was, of course, a totally different breed from Yusuf or Shekau, his successor. Gumi was a relentless debater and polemicist. For someone capable of such an extreme utterance as Christianity is nothing, he could still be counted something of a progressive. For instance, he believed in female education and the promotion of their electoral rights. What matters is that this cleric created, both directly and indirectly, a sizable and committed followership. His hard, uncompromising pronouncements on national politics also affected the attitude of a number of national leaders in crucial positions, social development, foreign policy, etc., but education most especially, thus paving the way for religious indoctrination over and beyond even the reaches of the madrasas, those Islamic schools where the foot soldiers of today's Boko Haram were nurtured. Gumi cast his long and wide influence, directly and covertly, over the nation's educational structures that were supposed to be national in character and presumably secular. The infiltration of Nigerian educational system also produced some of the current acknowledged godfathers of Boko Haram, even as it primed some of the future ideological propagators and actual midwives of the benighted movement. The extent of Gumi's influence in national affairs can be gauged by the following extract from a recent paper by a senator, a lawyer, at a Lagos symposium. He said, Gumi spearheaded the neo-Salafi Islamic reform for about 40 years, challenging what he believed were the Brotherhood's un-Islamic innovations, Bida, sponsoring the upgrading of modern Islamic education and insisting on the need to fully implement Sharia law at all levels in Nigeria. Gumi's exposure to the neo-Salafist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt had an impact on him. He was a strong advocate for increasing Muslim women access to education and their participation, as I said earlier, in electoral politics. He also translated the Quran into Hausa. Sheikh Gumi was an equally effective organizer. From his own biography, Where I Stand, comes the following extract, a glimpse into his post-independence activities and a revelation of his powers of mobilization and influence at the very pinnacle of Nigeria's policymakers and executors. Note that the Sardauna, who's mentioned in this extract I'm about to read, was the same Sardauna of Sokoto, who was the first premier of the northern region of Nigeria, which was amalgamated with the South in 1914. And the Sardauna also claimed direct descent from the noted jihadist Uthman Dan Fodio. Dan Fodio was also a remarkable figure in Nigerian history who had once sworn to dip the Quran into the Atlantic, that is, march all the way down south of present-day Nigeria, Islamizing the nation all the way, and by force of arms. However, from Gumi's biography, I quote, I discussed it with the Sardauna, that is his project, and accepted that there was the need for a more formal organization to handle the project. This is when we decided to sound out the opinion of some Muslims living in Kaduna. Eventually, the meeting prepared the brief agenda. Present at that first meeting, that's early in the 60s into independence, were the Premier, Sadana of Sokoto, Ali Akilu, Ahmed Tali, Ahmed Joda, Armita Katsina, and many others, including virtually all the Muslim permanent secretaries in the government. It was strictly voluntary, though, and a few did actually withdraw from the group later. We discussed at length the problem of teaching converts in this country and those who wanted to learn about Islam, because there were no qualified teachers or any serious organization they could turn to for help. Finally, we all agreed to set up an association to render this type of assistance. Malam Abu Bakr Imam suggested that it should also include our objective, so it was better to call it Jama'atu Nasril Islam, to which we all agreed. Now, this was the level of ideological pedigree to which Muhammad Yusuf and his gang aspired. However, the people let the latter understand that just as a fowl may be feathered, it is not the same as a contemplative owl. The name Boko Haram has stuck, so alas, have they. The irony is that leaders among these latter progeny were products of the very system that they were indoctrinated to despise, in the North most conspicuously. And so they came to view the state as an enemy of Islam that must be destroyed. Much of the so-called radicalization of such Muslim leaders took place within the universities, just as has been uncovered in instances among universities in the very heart of countries like Britain. There's nothing surreptitious about this movement, nothing about it. It was a doctrine, the repudiation of the state and of society that stood at the foundation of the Nigerian Wahhabist movement, the movement which began in Saudi Arabia. It was propagated within and under the protection, very often, of the university system itself. Its periodic manifestations are captured in the reports, several reports, which took place in Nigeria, such as the one that sat after some student-engendered riots in the city of Kano. An extract from that report paints the picture and delivers its intrinsic warning, alas, only partially heeded. I quote, "On the 29th September 1980, MSS, that's the Muslim Student Society which emerged from this movement, in ABU, that's the Ahmadu Bello University, destroyed many alcoholic drinks at a kiosk on the campus. The most militant of the MSS members would appear to be its deputy chairman, named Ibrahim El-Zakzaki, who was expelled from the ABU Zaria on the 14th December 1979 for his role in fomenting MSS unrest on the campus. El-Zakzaki was the brain behind a demonstration in Zaria by MSS members on 4th May 1980, when 10 busloads of the members drove around the city with the following inscriptions on the buses: "Down with the Nigerian Constitution, Islam only." On 20th August 1980, El-Zakzaki was reported to be circulating in the northern states with pamphlets captioned Fadakawa Ga Muslimi Nigeria, which means calling on Muslims in Nigeria, in which he condemned the Nigerian constitution for being anti-Islamic, called for an Islamic revolution, and urged Islamic students to rise against the federal government. He also demanded the recognition of the Sharia law. El-Zakzaki is reported to have visited on several occasions, and he recently returned from Iran, where he was said to have received training in planning and executing student unrest. Now, these are the early actualizing forces, the earliest organized actualizing forces of Gumi's Christianity is nothing. There were arrests, even some members of a trial, but it did not take long for El-Zakzaki and his followers to be back in circulation. We must make it clear, however, that violent though Gumi's language was, and provocative in the extreme in a multi-religious nation, both in his writings and preaching for Islamic renewal, it is not recorded anywhere that he was an advocate of actual violence against the state or against unbelievers. I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable, nor is it of any relevance to this discourse, to track the movements of the various schools of Islamic thought in contention, fought for supremacy among themselves, especially during the immediate post-independence period. My interest has mostly lain within the phenomenon of insidious enslavement, by which I mean that compulsive temper of a part of society to soften up the rest for eventual outright subjugation, resorting where necessary to the shock tactics of unanticipated violence, confining the privilege of choice to their limited coterie to the exclusion of others, and building up a protective carapace around themselves, no matter with what material, secular, theocratic, or simply cultic, like the military or ethnic, in order to render themselves and their methods unanswerable to the rest, no matter the degree of criminality or outrage. Because renewal is a common feature of most religions, and Islam is no exception. Those who are interested in the internal schisms within Islam, however, will discover that the more pacific, non-political side of Islam, as represented by the mystic temper of Sufism, for instance, has been prominently in deadly conflict with the rest, as generally identified, let's say, with the Shiites, the Sunnis, the Wahhabis, and others. The most aggressive tend to be the most conservative, whose interpretation of renewal has always favored a return to basics, quote, or simply call it fundamentalism. The geography of catchment for this latter tendency in Nigeria appears to have centered among the Kanuri in northern Nigeria, largely through the preaching of one Sheikh Ismaila Idris bin Zakaria, a sympathizer, if not exactly a formal disciple of Sheikh Gumi. Gumi's influence was at its peak in the years that followed independence, fostered by the title of Grand Vizier of northern Nigeria. Opinion has it that this influence of his waned after that title was abolished in 1967. But by then, he had established his own followership, and his gospel had been carried into the neighboring countries, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, wherever the Kanuri were to be found. It is generally accepted within Nigeria that Mohammed Yusuf, founder of Boko Haram, came under the influence of a Sheikh Jafar Mahmoud Adam, whose base was the Indimi Mosque, a Wahhabi stronghold. The control of mosques has proved a perennial trigger for violent internal wars within Islam, since leadership at Friday prayers signaled enormous control over the Muslim population in any area of contention. One feature was common to all: the need to engage in Islamic renewal wherever Islam spread its wings, and to engage not only in conversion, but to ensure that local impurities did not penetrate through to Islam through the cultural and religious contentions of the autochthones, or foreign intruders such as the Christians. Perhaps this explains the ferocity with which even minor differences in rituals or their omission in Islamic practice took on such alarming dimensions. Those who wish to place the internal dynamics of Islam in an easily digested capsule, especially insofar as it impacted on followers, can do worse than regard that religion as shaped, especially in its impact on overall society, shaped by a perennial tussle between the two major tendencies of the Tajdid, or renewal. For one side, it meant going back to basics of fundamentalism, conservatism, and the other, a progression that takes into account the dynamic effect of a changing world, as happened in Turkey. Sheikh Gumi's international recognition in 1987 as laureate of King Faisal's foundation belonged to the former category of Islamic renewal, the conservative tendency, with, of course, some minor attributions. Mohammed Yusuf's eventual rupture with his mentor, Sheikh Jafar, was based on Yusuf's dissatisfaction with the tempo and limitations of Jafar's approach to this mission of conservative, quote-unquote, renewal. For Yusuf, renewal implied the necessity of overturning the state completely and subjecting its governance to his brand of Islam in all ramifications. For that purpose, the instrumentality of violence, including the killing of unbelievers, that narrow interpretation of a certain section of the Quran, were paramount. It was a divinely sanctioned imperative. And he began to forge local alliances with political figures for that single-minded cause, turning the nation into an Islamic state that was governed by the laws of the Sharia. Who sought out whom, offering his services? We do not know exactly. And let me mention that the following account is vigorously denied by the survivor of that unholy alliance, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, when voices, including myself, joined in exposing such individuals, especially one in particular, an ex-governor, and demanding his arrest and trial. He denies the charges. That principal accused is one Ali Modu Sharif, the former governor of Borno State, who was seeking re-election in the 2007 governorship elections. He came together with Yusuf Mohammed, who had by then begun to earn a reputation for violence, to launch a program of intimidation and religion-motivated harassment. Yusuf's mentor, whom I mentioned earlier, Jafar, the preacher at Ndimi Mosque, tried to rein him in, to get him to sever his involvement in partisan politics. He failed, and the two parted company. In the end, Jafar also paid with his life, assassinated in his mosque, as he prepared to denounce Yusuf during his Friday sermons. It was too late. Creating a state within this state had already become an obsession with Yusuf as he moved to attack and take over police stations and also other state institutions. Within civic society, attacks on non-Islamic institutions had commenced, especially the far-flung churches. Boko Haram began to live up to its designation. Western education is anathema, the book is profanity. The targeting of learning institutions became more and more ruthless and systematic. First, it was tertiary institutions like universities and colleges. Christian chapels in universities were attacked during service, then threats followed by arson to the institutions themselves. The University of Maiduguri in Borno State was attacked and eventually closed down. There was no shortage of public warnings, demands for urgent action. Boko Haram was still weak, sporadic, and disorganized. Its arsenal largely homemade, its targets random. In a lecture at the University of Calabar, I drew the attention of the government to the example of President Lyndon Johnson, who mobilized the National Guard of the nation to escort one black girl to school. If such affirmative action could be taken in a country that was still largely racist, I urged, there was no reason or a nation like Nigeria, survivor of a brutal civil war, accorded plaudits, honed and toned in several United Nations peace missions, I could not see why such a nation could not pick up the gauntlet and protect its institutions, especially at that stage. The reign of impunity had begun, however. Eye on elections. The reluctance to offend a religious section of the populace, some of whose influential leaders were clearly, at the very least, sympathetic to the Boko Haram rampage. Escalation of atrocities became routine. Boko Haram was no longer settled in the peripheries of society, but was infiltrating, settling in villages and towns. It was developing a network of spies. Safe houses were being established in the heart of the cities, and the tactics of hostage-taking, which was begun, by the way, by a different kind of movement, the MEND in the oil-producing areas, that tactics was also adopted by Boko Haram. Learning institutions remained primary targets, from kindergarten to tertiary institutions. A boarding house in the College of Technology in Kaduna was invaded at night. The attackers came armed with a list from which they began to call out names, clearly supplied from within. In ones and twos and threes, those listed, all non-Muslims, were called out, shot, knifed, clobbered to death. Throats were routinely slit. Yes, at that stage, the victims were virtually non-Muslims. That stage soon passed. The mission of renewal required that even Muslims be seen to conform to Yusuf's narrow vision of a pure Islam. Thus, earlier immunity through mere religious affirmation dissipated in the frenzy of killings. Among those who rejoiced at those increasing bouts of religious cleansing are those who later became casualties, as the mesh of impurity became narrower and narrower, and the politics of terror assumed supremacy over any catechisms of affirmation. Many erstwhile collaborators in the activities of Boko Haram, young and old, of whatever religious persuasion, have today become victims of terror. Indeed, their ranks have leapfrogged those of infidels in the statistics of casualties. They become prime targets. Their leaders, those who unleashed the monstrosity on society today, seek protection of that same state whose very existence they once professed to despise, since the state was infidel. Some of them, notable names, current, have become card-carrying members of the ruling party of infidels, both for self-protection and to earn immunity from prosecution. However, they still claim to have followership, and so they are considered assets for coming elections. A desperate state with an eye on election time welcomes them with open arms, no matter how elbow-deep their arms are in the sump of innocent blood. Such are the wages of impunity. General Buhari, a controversial former head of state, whose rule, together with his deputy, is sometimes referred to as the reign of the Iron Duo, has lately and unbelievably become a passionate and active advocate for and participant in the democratic process. He has stood for presidency 4 times already, and is apparently, or 3 times, and is apparently gearing up for another bout. In one of his recent interviews, he was asked the question that is paramount on the minds of all Nigerians and certainly preoccupies many external observers. He was asked, "What are your plans for dealing with Boko Haram if you succeed in being elected?" His reply has become consistent of late, unsparing in condemnation. Boko Haram, he declares, was a creation of the culture of impunity. If severe and instant action had been taken against the perpetrators of those crimes, it would not have become the problem it is today. Reinforcing that position, this dour, born-again Democrat stressed, I quote, "When this question of Boko Haram started, I'm sure it was on record that the first statement I made about 18 months ago, I said, no religion advocates what is happening. So basically, it is no case of religion. It is neither ethnic. When they kill children in schools in the Northeast, they kill teachers, they burn churches, they burn mosques, they burn motor parks, they burn markets. Where is religion there? Where is ethnicity there? This is terrorism, and I hope the government will come to terms with it, will come to grip with it. Impunity, of course, takes many more forms than is often considered. It is also not exclusively engendered from within. What primarily appalls one's humane sensibilities has been naturally the thirst for slaughter, often of the most sadistic nature. But the excusing that follows atrocities evokes a special kind of rage. It is useful to recall in this connection the butchery that followed the attempted visit of a German evangelist, one Dr. Bonka, in northern Nigeria a few decades ago, even before the appearance and activities of Boko Haram. But within the same orbit of Sheikh Gumi's magisterial pronouncement, Christianity is nothing. The intensity of one's rage at the killings, including of children in schools, becomes subdued under the construction of an enabling environment of impunity through the pronouncements of a school of external liberal observers, ever ready to accept the inexcusable. We heard statements like, Reverend Bonke has been provocative. Why did he take his Christian mission to the north, knowing that this was a predominantly Muslim region? Only an insensitive person would do that. It was all part of Western insensitivity and arrogance, etc., and a lot more in that vein. Nigeria, however, was and still is a multi-religious nation whose constitution not merely enshrines the rights of her citizens to believe or not believe, to practice or not practice, to propagate or not propagate their religions. And of course, asks the question, in the land of the Vatican, the seat of the supreme pontiff of one branch of Christendom, do you or do you not safeguard other religions and their practices, other religions such as Islam, the right of existence? Does the largest mosque in Europe not dominate the Roman landscape? So impunity is not limited, however, to discrimination in terms of the creation, guarantee of space. Alas, it represents a set attitude, a set state of mind, often carefully inculcated. It involves an overt softening up of the terrain, capturing territory and advancing even further, cultivating an artificial hypersensitivity in which any act can be made, any act or pronouncement can be made an instant offense that results in deadly instigated riots. And mine goes again to just one other example, a wasted journey of mine between Los Angeles and Kano to deliver a lecture at the invitation of a governor of Kano State, and who became later a presidential candidate. His name is Shekarau. He's now a minister in President Jonathan's cabinet. I landed in Lagos, only to find that the event had been cancelled. Reason? A teacher had set his pupils the task of writing an essay on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. One of those pupils had gone further and accompanied his essay with a portrait, envisioning what the Prophet must have looked like. Impressed, the teacher passed it round the class. He was a foreign teacher. On returning home, another pupil in that class reported the quote-unquote sacrilege to his parents. As some of you know, creating a likeness of God or the Prophet is forbidden in Islam. The following day, the parent gathered a mob and went up to the teacher. I returned to Los Angeles a few days later without ever moving near Kano. The governor of a progressive cast of mind had immediately cancelled all his engagements, visited the scene, and quelled a riot that claimed several non-Muslim lives and saw the destruction of public buildings, including the police station where the teacher had taken refuge. To consolidate his intervention, Shekarau set a leadership example. He joined the Christians the following Sunday in worship. He was indeed a rare example. By contrast, you may wish to look for the name Akaluka under the dictator Sani Abacha. Akaluka's head was paraded through the streets of Kaduna in broad daylight. He was not even the one alleged to have desecrated the pages of the Quran, but his brother. However, they couldn't find him, so they picked on his brother, took refuge as usual, police station destroyed, was dragged out, etc., etc. Look for numerous other names, such as Oluwatosin, an invigilator in national exams, whose candidates accused her of desecrating the Quran. Now, how did she do this? She confiscated copies from cheating students in the National Religious Knowledge Examination. She had similarly seized Bibles from other delinquent candidates. However, the Muslims in that class beat her, stripped her naked, necklaced her with a motorcar tire, a vehicle tire, and set her ablaze after she'd taken refuge in the office of the headmaster. Of these and hundreds other cases, rarely was an arrest made, and in those exceptions, the cases simply petered off. A Yoruba proverb goes, "Melo melo la aka leyin adepele." It means, how many teeth do you count in the multiple layers of dental deformity? The sad fact is simply the failure to make a connection, to understand that one pronouncement in the encouragement of impunity is all it takes to create a ripple that separates communities and designates one side as permanent victim and the other aggressor, with or without a cause, but justified. Just as very few minds succeed in making a connection between the Ayatollah Khomeini's annunciation of a death fatwa against Salman Rushdie for allegedly insulting Islam through his work, Satanic Verses. Even so, in a smaller pond, does a declaration such as Christianity or Hinduism is nothing by a Muslim scholar constitute a call to mayhem, trigger of sanguinary ripples in normally placid backwaters where grievances, even where genuine, were formally settled through recourse to law or through traditional methods of conflict resolution. Empowerment is the word that answers the phenomenon, empowerment of a negative coloring, which eventually becomes structured and predatory, constantly on the lookout for victims. Sooner or later, it is no longer satisfied with the identification of the enemy as external, that is, outside the privileged community, but most especially as internal, under renewal. Already armed by the acquired authority of an open, unpublished language of provocation, it assigns itself the role of purifier. Into this conglomeration of eager hands steps the neat, calculating manipulator, in whose hands the unwashed masses become putty. But putty not as in a children's plaything, but as in Semtex. These masses who are used are featureless, washed clean of individuation, fearless because they envisage no consequence, no one to hold to account, since their mentors themselves walk the streets free. And so the foot soldiers are ready to be used. They are the ones who are gathered together in a trice, placed in a bus, and transported to commence mayhem, even 100 miles away. The figures are numbing. The statistics of organized death simply addle the mind until it seizes up. Just one more instance, perhaps, a reminder of the most grotesque assault, in my view, on society, one which, on account of its international context, attained global notoriety. The International Beauty Contest, which was brought to Nigeria, a grand spectacular that, just as a footnote, had the wife of the then head of state as one of the business sponsors on some level or the other. I'm not a fan of beauty contests, but the important thing is chacun a son goût, each one to his or her taste. So even this involvement of the wife of the then head of state did not save this intended show that was built to confer an international entertainment status to Abuja, Nigeria's own Brasilia, that was conceived or misconceived and built as a national symbol of unity to underline the nation's commitment to the principle of unity in diversity. Diversity especially of ethnicities, cultures, and faiths. That's supposed to be the philosophy of Abuja. Well, some Muslim leaders raised their voices in protest, swore that it would not take place. The site offended, it claimed, their religious sensibilities, and it did not. The extremist shock squads saw to that. It was too good an opportunity to soften up the ground a bit more in the overall vision of placing a nation under religious submission. The raiders came from outside, organized by the fanatical leaders. Over 400 people lost their lives in the capital city of Abuja, the seat of government. The most popular markets in Garki, the commercial sector, were gutted, goods destroyed, millions. Nation's capital was placed under siege. No one, to the best of my knowledge, till today, was ever placed on trial. As usual, the event was not without the rationalization by the cultural guardians of Africa's pristine existence, which must not be polluted. Comments, aping of decadent Western lifestyles, beauty contests. This is where it all leads. No one is surprised. I was obliged to educate such voices on the existence of beauty parades in African pre-colonial societies, including even what I refer to as the male peacock rituals, where men parade themselves and dance in courtship rituals with an audience of marriageable females. And then who could have forgotten so soon, perhaps, just when the nation was dying, the assault was dying down, the nation was licking its wounds, a female journalist expressed her disgust at the wanton killings. In the unlucky words, "What's all the fuss about? Why the hypocrisy? If Prophet Muhammad were alive, he would have taken one or more of these beauties to wife," which I thought was a compliment to Prophet Muhammad's aesthetic tastes. However, that commentary took the imbroglio to a different level altogether and introduces us here to an individual whom I have conveniently elected as our prime example of the embodiment and calculating beneficiary of impunity of the Nigerian culture, of impunity, and one with a long hidden history in the trajectory of the extremist agenda that has now manifested itself as Boko Haram. The comment by the journalist declared the governor of a northern state, Zamfara, his deputy, if we must be specific, the substantive governor being away at the time, that declaration, that comment, aside of this young journalist was a capital offense. The girl has insulted the revered prophet, and she deserved the ultimate sanction, death. He promptly issued a killing fatwa, death to the journalist. The journal's offices were burned to the ground, the staff considering themselves lucky to have escaped with their lives. The substantive governor could not wait to reinforce the sentence the moment he touched ground, and he pronounced that it was the duty of any Muslim, anywhere, to track down and kill this journalist. Of course, this was accompanied by a number of sympathy bonfires and casual to organize slaughters in various parts of the Islamic North. This criminal incitement to murder was followed by a visit of appeasement to the Muslim stronghold institutions and leaders of the North by the then Nigerian head of state. Not a word of rebuke of the incendiary and homicidal statements of that governor by the central government. Not a reminder that as custodian of Nigeria's laws and constitution, he could not stand aside and let the crime of incitement to murder of a citizen pass unchallenged. Now, Nigerian state governors enjoy constitutional immunity while in office, but not outside, once outside office, as some have learned their cost, including one Ibori you might have heard of, the former governor of Delta State, who in fact enjoyed his immunity to the extent that he defied the security. After he left office, he was sufficiently organized to stand off the security forces for a number of days, refused to submit to arrest, fled to Dubai, but eventually ended up in England, where the laws of money laundering did not extend to immunity as a national institution. Anyway, he was finally bundled, he was trapped in England, and is still enjoying the hospitality of Queen Elizabeth in one of the prisons over there. But all governors, once they leave office, they lose immunity. And the argument of some of us publicly was, why has this governor, why has the nation not been served a lesson, an anti-impunity lesson, by being arrested and tried, at the very least, for incitement to murder? Such processes, when they are in office, we know, are fraught with complications, but once they leave office, there's absolutely no excuse. And if you want to capture, just in one single event, the comprehensive face, a comprehensive face of impunity in this Nigeria experience, all you have to do is visit the record of that ex-legislator, ex-governor and present senator, and his enjoyment of absolute protection, no matter what crime he committed, including pedophilia. A serial pedophiliac, this governor, ex-governor, and senator, his answer when he was accused of transporting, of not just pedophilia, but transborder sex trade, because the laws of Egypt, from where he took his latest 11-year-old bride, actually protect underage children and forbid marriage at that non-puberty stage. And the existence of people like that governor, because of the political advantages derived by incumbents in office, especially at the center, this is what encouraged even the activities of Boko Haram at a very rudimentary stage. The ability to kill, to imprison, to turn, in fact, into sex slaves, innocent women without any effect, any response from the central government. Just another example. When, at the very beginning, when the activities, the atrocities of Boko Haram were still in single digits, and the security services, to their credit, did their homework and succeeded in arresting in flagrante a legislator and his henchmen. Both of them were put on trial. And what happened? The elders of the North kept pressuring the government to release the legislator. On what grounds? They didn't say it, but they said, oh, it's the only way we can make peace, we can arbitrate, we can reconcile, but the trial has got to stop. The Justice Department said, no, this man has committed offenses, committed crimes, which led to the killings of people. And so he remained under trial. And of course, the activities of Boko Haram continue in any case, even if he had not been arrested. And what did these worthy elders say when the president then appealed to civic society to assist in curtailing and stopping the escalation of Boko Haram violence? They said, well, we told you to terminate the criminal proceedings against so-and-so, but you preferred to listen to other views. All right, go and solve the problem yourself. Now, the companion of the legislator had been arrested, was placed under trial, pleaded guilty, and had been sentenced to prison terms. But the legislator, his trial was maintained on technical grounds, just delayed, just so that he could be freed. It was that statement was a derisive statement, implicit in self-indictment as accessories before and or after the fact. A declaration of tacit approval of actions that had destroyed lives and was strangulating society. Those elders extended their own charter of immunity to the terrorizing agents, extended their license to all comers to come and partake in the chalice of secret power. It would take a while yet, and the decimation of their ranks by the same Boko Haram before a number of them realized that their cloak of impunity was not recognized any longer by their erstwhile allies. They began to seek protection under the state against the very protégés over whom they had now lost control. Now, there are always bits and pieces of events lost in the quiltwork of a people's history, fragments that seem insignificant at the time, but contribute to obtaining a full and clear picture of how a people come to be where they are. It's a pity that they're often lost forever. However, here is one, just a little one, for whatever value it may have for grasping the mythology of trends and the reality, for grasping the patterns, the cumulative process that leads very often to nation disaster. Among the various viable dates that are often touted as the birth date of Boko Haram in Nigeria is the date on which one of the Nigerian states unilaterally declared itself an Islamic theocracy within what is constitutionally a secular nation, or, as some of them prefer to say, a multi-religious nation. In making that declaration, shortly to be followed by 8 others, that is the declaration of Zamfara as a Muslim state, that governor, on the surface of it, was merely fulfilling an electoral pledge. What, however, was the genesis of that promise? I think we all recall the destructive rule of one General Sani Abacha. After his demise and the return to democratic rule, there were naturally the coming together negotiations between various opposition forces at the time, different ideologies, different groupings, but all united in the mission of getting rid of the military from civic life once and for all. Meetings took place both within and outside the nation, many of them unpublicized. One such took place between a sympathizer of our own opposition movement, the National Liberation Council of Nigeria, and a hitherto unknown politician who claimed to be a disciple of the late Aminu Kano, a reputed Muslim radical politician. The name of that sympathizer, yes, that same Ahmed Yerima, author of the killing fatwa against the young journalist. The meeting, held at Yerima's own instigation, held in Washington, D.C., and took place, as I said, at his instigation. Now, he had already made it known that on taking power in his state, Zamfara, he would institute governance by Sharia. But Sharia also has many levels of interpretation, of execution, of implementation, etc., etc. He always managed to make people believe that just the mild Sharia, because Sharia already exists in the nation's constitution, but Sharia as law, in arbitrational law between civilians, among civilians, marriage laws, property laws, etc., etc., but not to the extent of, shall we say, even criminal law, certain forms of crimes which are covered by the federal state. So even so, our sympathizers are asking, why on earth he had chosen such a retrograde step? And his reply was that the front-runner party was so deeply entrenched and that they couldn't match their war chest. So he had to give the people something close to their hearts, but in a mild dose. Give that impression that our man said, okay, if that's the purpose, just to seize power from this conservative and corrupt government, all right, go ahead. So that's how Yerima won and became governor. It was during that period of governorship that he passed that killing fatwa against the journalist. But what was baffling, but should not have been surprising, was the pace and enthusiasm that Yerima brought into the exercise of Sharia, securitization of his state. Rigorous steps to enforce and even expand the trimmings of Sharia laws. For instance, he ordered immediately a whole fleet of buses to enforce the separation of the sexes in a state where such a thing had never been known, sex in public transportation. He created the notorious Hezbollah, a parallel police force, to ensure public morality, and he personally led the charge in raids on hotels and destructions of alcoholic drinks, etc., etc. Men were ordered to grow beards or else. While the public was distracted from this show of religious enthusiasm, Yerima proceeded to loot the treasure with a single-mindedness, such abandon, that his became the first case file to be presented to the president by the newly formed anti-corruption agency known as the EFCC. That president shoved it aside with the same calculated indifference as he had treated that even graver issue of the rampaging theocratic governance of a state. Excuse me. And what was the response of our government? What was the presidential response? Complicity, a permissive inertia. But why? Why was he indifferent to the findings even of a commission, anti-corruption commission that he himself had set up? Why did he push the files aside and say, no, go in that other direction. There's more crime there, more corruption. Leave that, I can handle Zamfara and Yerima. Well, he, at the time, his name is Olusegun Obasanjo, he was planning an unconstitutional third term. He was planning to change the constitution in order to serve a third term in office. And he needed allies, he needed governors. And so he allowed that extreme theocratization to take place, just as he allowed that same governor to declare a citizen wanted, dead or alive. The files, according to the testimony of Ribadu himself, who's a young man who I know very well, and with whom I collaborated on certain levels in his mission, he himself has declared, he has apologized, in fact, in saying that his commission was used, that he himself had been used. His enthusiasm as an anti-corruption czar had been used and compromised by the politics of the time. When Yerima was challenged, for instance, for his cross-border transportation of a sex object, underage sex object, what did he say? He said, I'm a Muslim and follow only the dictates of the Quran. What the Quran mandates me to do, I do. What it does not, I do not. Nowhere does the Quran forbid me to marry an 11-year-old girl. And he added, for good measure, a reminder that the Prophet Muhammad espoused the 9-year-old Aisha. Thus, he was only following the example of the Holy Prophet. The opposition, Muslim leaders and scholars included, pointed out that the Prophet only espoused the underage girl but did not consummate the marriage. Whereas Yerima, from all that could be deduced, did so. Now Yerima, after leaving office, had become a senator, a lawmaker. The laws which he was flouting at the time were laws passed by the Nigerian legislation. The Quran, he said, is superior to any man-made constitution. It's not these claims we're talking about. It is the protection, the acceptance of such claims in a multi-religious state with a constitution which is very clear on what can be done, what is legal or illegal. The story, however, is not ended. And I earnestly stress that we're not really speaking here of any one individual. No, we're talking about subterranean currents which existed in society and which were ignored until they turned into a torrent that threatened to sweep away the very foundations of society. We must not underestimate, of course, the genuine grievances which movements have against society, against corrupt governance, for instance. A very real, near quantifiable reality of alienation that stems from economic disparities, the lack of social opportunities, marginalization, arrogance, wealth, exhibition, ostentatious living, etc., etc. We cannot underestimate the bitterness of the marginalized, the impoverished, to whom existence becomes meaningless and can only be dignified by one last gesture against society, one last self-destructive gesture, which is what produces, in some cases, the suicide bomber. The incantation of remedial action through social measures is obviously more than mere incantation. It's a necessity. It's a reminder that social justice remains incomplete without penetration through some very lamentable beginnings. But we must always differentiate between, on the one hand, let us say, even Osama bin Laden's transcendental flash, his moment of truth, that eventually evolved into delusions of omnipotence, grandeur, but at the same time distinguish between even the genuineness of Muslim, Islamic, or religious conviction of any kind, and the opportunistic aspects whose perpetrators are ready to inflict any damage on society, either to protect their own criminality or to acquire power and dominate the environment. We are all endangered when, as in the case of Boko Haram, we encounter reductionist salves, such as Boko Haram commenced life when its leader was extrajudicially killed, something we've been hearing so often. Graduating, as has been the case, to this was a peaceful group of religious practitioners which only asked to be left on its own to worship Allah on its own until its leader was set upon and killed. Suddenly, forgotten in the revisionist school are the proud exploits of leadership of Boko Haram, Yusuf and the others. Some of them including the seizures of Christian families and congregations and other non-practicing, non-Muslims, some of whom were killed because they were given an option, knives at their throats, convert or have your throats slit. Suddenly it was no longer a psychopath who was unquestionably murdered by state agencies. It was a saint and martyr. And society is then held to be paying full retribution for a crime against an innocent man. It was this attitude that led a former head of state to pay condolence visit to the family of the murdered man, to plead with the family to, I quote, forgive and forget the so-called, and end the so-called revenge killings that Boko Haram was inflicting on society. It was the convenience of such amnesia, for instance, that led the state to organize so swiftly after the killing of Yusuf, very quickly, a case against the state, most unusual in Nigeria, against the state for unlawful killing. The claims, the action was heard in record time by a magistrate flown to, I think it was, flown to Borno anyway for the case. Damages were awarded. The check was prepared in record time. The check was taken to the family of Boko Haram by high-placed government officials, hoping that the payment of how many millions would stop a movement that had such fundamental a history that goes all the way back to the beginnings of independence and whose leaders were thoroughly committed in the movement of a program to change the very face of a nation. The fostering of the culture of impunity, as we've said, is not always internal, and it's not always malign. Sometimes it is well meant, but it remains nonetheless dangerous and lamentable, especially with external interventionists. The interventionists very often lack the in-depth and holistic knowledge of the affected terrain, its history, long-term history, the sociologies also of the parties in conflict. Such interventionists witness only the eruption. They totally miss the accumulation of undercurrents. That such porters of good intentions only end up acting against the interests of the assailed human community is totally lost on them. That they protect, in the end, the interests of the powerful against the powerless, the exploiters against the exploited, the bullies against the helpless, the conniving against the naive. These are prospects which they refuse to consider. They forget that the state is not always the Goliath of internal conflicts, nor the assailants, the Davids. In any case, it is the humanity that gets clobbered to a pulp with our conflicts of certain levels. From the glib assurances of what a people who are already prone under the ruthlessness of tyranny can tolerate, such interventionists move to an unintended, indeed an unconscious allegiance to the side of power in various forms. The language changes, but the effect remains the same. All the way from the horror days of the Idi Amins, the Bokassas, the Mobutu Sese Sekos, and now to the entrenchment of the borderless forces of religion-inspired terrorism. Their position seems to be summed up as, don't touch the bullies. You may end up worsening the condition of the victims. We heard the same statement, the same sentiment during the anti-apartheid states. But this position only gives joy, predictably, to the aggressors, and of course starves the victims of that assistance, which, given the sometimes critical factor of timing, may have stemmed the tide of enemy at a yet manageable state. They hand over tactical victory to inhuman forces, whereas those forces also count on the timorousness of potential forces of assistance. They collaborate in the blocking of possible aid. Any informed scholar, for instance, should not require to be told of the cross-border mobility and solidarity of impunity as a weapon of extremist forces. A time when any neophyte of history should be able to accurately divine the inevitable expansionism of even locally brewed movements of terror and its flow into the international arena is not the time. It's not the time for some groups of scholars to write letters to potential aid of salvation for people, write letters, let's say to the US Department, that certain movements should not be declared international terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations. The document which has inspired these comments I'm making was a document which was presented to the State Department by a group of scholars in the United States, pleading that the US should not declare Boko Haram a terrorist organization. That document was a study in speciousness, implicated outright permissiveness for the growth and expansion of Boko Haram. The arguments proffered are ranged against crucial moves towards effective choices in the strategic containment of this move, which now sometimes looks unstoppable. Now, I do not dispute that in that document, I'll read some sections of it in a moment, I do not dispute that some of the arguments espoused there are valid. I do not deny that the authors of the letter do admit the viciousness of the enemy. My protest concern is directed at the implicitly enabling summation of their position. Enabling, that is, to the villains of the peace. Not surprisingly, this letter, this position, which was argued both within and the document published without, it succeeded in restraining the hand of the State Department during a critical time that could only have profited the terrorists. It gave them time to regroup, consolidate their own external alliances, and exploit lines of recruitment and refurbishment, which arguably sapped the morale of both government and the immediate victims. There's hardly any need for me to reiterate the following. The will of governance to resist a threat to its people should not depend on whether or not a toxic movement is declared a terrorist organization by a foreign government. My concern is simply to stress the necessity of tracking tributaries, the contributions to the armory of impunity that is enjoyed by the enemies of humanity. We're not dealing here with just a ragtag bunch of casual incendiaries and suicide bombers. No, we're dealing with the product of sophisticated minds, schooled not only in Islamic disciplines, but experienced in foreign diplomacy and the analysis of foreign policies. Here's an excerpt from the appeal. I quote, "As scholars with a special interest in Nigeria and broad expertise on African politics, we're writing to urge that you do not designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. We are acutely aware of the horrific violence perpetrated by Boko Haram, including attacks on both Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, whether government officials or civilian targets. We share your concern about the impact of extremist violence of Nigeria's democratic progress and security in general. However, an FTO designation would internationalize Boko Haram, legitimize abuse by Nigeria's security services, limit the State Department's latitude in shaping a long-term strategy, and undermine the U.S. government's ability to receive effective, independent analysis from the religion," and so on and so forth. This letter would internationalize Boko Haram. Boko Haram has been internationalized ages before. Abused by security forces. What of U.S. records in foreign lands, internally, abuses of civilians by security forces? Sometimes when I read a letter like this, I wonder whether Boko Haram, in fact, has succeeded in infiltrating even U.S. society and their intellectuals. I just do not. Internationalization, Boko Haram may have begun as a locally brewed movement, but definitely over the past 3-4 years, no one can say that it's not internationalized. And so many other arguments into which I don't wish to dwell. Some of these scholars are even friends of mine. We've been together in the line of fire against dictatorship, abuse of human rights. They understand the internal workings of a civil society like Nigeria. They know that Nigerians themselves are the first to decry abuse and excesses of security forces. Baja, the name of that village in the northern village, for instance, this was Nigeria's internal organizations, civil rights organizations, that decried excessive force used by the military before it even came to external knowledge. And so to succeed that abuse takes place in Nigeria, full stop, nothing happens within Nigeria. It's a very patronizing attitude towards the complexity of Nigerian society. I don't want you to go into this because I don't want it to seem that I'm pleading a case of the government. No, I'm pleading a case of the people and saying that foreign organizations, even if they share the same ideology, should be very careful about the position they take and their presentation of the internal network of pros and cons which take place in Nigeria in difficult situations. Finally, we end on our are elected pointer to the territory of impunity and the histories that are sometimes hidden. We met this man, as I told you, during the struggle against Abacha. And here was an individual who was supposed to be a disciple of a respected radical politician from the North, who turned out, in fact, to have a history, a very long history, of the various participation and membership of the forces that have bred the final, the apogee, if you like, of Sheikh Gumi's philosophy of Christianity is nothing, Islam is all. I quote from the testimony of a former ambassador, a 4-year-old veteran of Nigeria's Foreign Service, Ambassador Dada, his name is, who served in several Islamic nations and retired quite recently. He was interviewed, and his interview was published in the Nigerian media. This is what he said. At that time also, Sonny Yerima, the former governor of Zamfara State, was in Sudan for 2 weeks and underwent indoctrination. He was exposed to all the training camps of Osama bin Laden, who was my neighbor. In fact, Osama bin Laden's office in Sudan was just a few blocks away from our embassy. No report was made. Our embassy never reported Osama bin Laden. In addition to having his headquarters in Sudan, Osama bin Laden also had many firms and industries which he only used as a facade because he was actually using those firms as training camps for Al-Qaeda. Among his trainees were many Nigerians from the north. They would leave Nigeria as if they were going to study where were other training camps of Osama bin Laden. I got wind of all these things and told them, but my reports were dismissed. It was a policy of see nothing, say nothing, because they were working for Muslims. They were not able to draw the line between Arabization and Islamization. What Sudan was practicing was both Arabization and Islamization, which led to the breakaway of the South from the North. That was the dangerous part of it, which was also my major concern. In fact, that was the main concern of Mo Ibrahim, the richest Sudanese. That's why it pained him seriously up till now that Sudan must not have divided just because of religion. And it's one of the reasons why he established the Mo Ibrahim Prize. That is the motive behind the prize. Up till today, the man is still pained. So is the nation called Nigeria pained. So are its citizens. So are the families of the 250 abducted children brought together, most conveniently, for mass enslavement. The stakes have risen as the ever-present Boko Haram, sunken in Algeria, resurfaces in northern Nigeria, dislodged in Somalia, erupts in Mali. Has anyone visited Niger lately? Does anyone read signs at all? Same agenda, only different vestments and names under careful management, but with clear evidence of a creeping Wahhabism. Well, fortunately, all is not bleak. The world appears to have woken to the universal menace of a virulent, fanatic disposition that merely hides under the cloak of a religious propagation. That's where I agree with our General Buhari. And even the true Islamic nations ultimately acknowledge the danger to their very existence of a Frankenstein that has run amok, has appropriated their identity in global recognition, and daily violate their own scriptures. It is a sad, belated awakening. However, somewhere among the hadiths, even of the Prophet Muhammad, I'm sure there is a surah that reads, "It is never too late to return to the path of truth." Of course, that opens up another debate altogether. just what is truth? Is it truth as per Boko Haram, or is it truth as per the Tieno Boka, the sage of Bandiagara in Mali, who says, there's your truth, there's my truth, and there is the truth? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wole Soyinka, for a passionate, provocative, and disturbing lecture. The hour is late. If people have to leave, please avail yourself of the opportunity now. But Wole Soyinka has graciously agreed to respond to some questions and comments from the audience. We have a few minutes here. If you have a question or comment to put, I would ask that you identify yourselves, that you speak succinctly, and I'll collect a few such questions or comments and then give our guests an opportunity to respond. So is there anyone? Someone circulates with a microphone to assist you.
Thank you for that presentation, sir. I'm David Burbach from the Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island. And I was wondering, in addition to declaring Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization, what else could the United States do to help Nigeria with this threat in terms of any sort of either security, military assistance, or politically? What could the United States do to contribute to resolving the problem?
Do you want to respond now or collect a few more? It's up to you.
Yeah, okay. Whichever method you want. Yeah, but I'll have to take note. My memory is not as good as you want.
Then
to
why
paint
don't
it.
you respond to that question?
Okay.
That's fine.
The first thing is that there's a dilemma involved, we know, for nations, not just the United States, for nations which have obtained a certain powerful and sometimes notorious status in world affairs. That dilemma exists. One which doesn't want to be conspicuous, doesn't want to be to seem to teleguide what happens elsewhere. But I think there comes a situation where even the greatest cynics and critics recognize the fact that a problem is no longer local, even if it ever was. The difference is those who are bold enough or just don't give a damn, and who say we won't wait for it until it festers, until we now have to use greater energy, greater resources to stem it. France is very much one of those nations. That's why France, for instance, was able to intervene, together with the approval of African nations who followed almost immediately, ECOWAS and so on, and stem the tide in Mali. The United States was not involved in that movement whatsoever. And I think the wisdom is just to avoid unilateral action, to collaborate with both the affected areas, the other forces, units in the areas, organizations like Africa Union, ECOWAS, ECOMOG, etc., as is happening now, where we have the Islamic nations participating in stemming a certain menace. Beyond that, I have no other recommendation except for that the United States should recognize itself as just another nation which simply has more resources to expend in directions of danger to humanity. Collaborate, and of course, don't recolonize. Don't recolonize. That above all.
Another question? Will you wait for the microphone, please?
In the 1960s for about
Excuse me, sir. Would you identify yourself and would you wait for the microphone, please?
I was a secondary school teacher in the Northeast region for about 3 years in the 1960s, and I recall that most of my students felt that they were more or less left behind by the government, and that there had been very few efforts to create jobs in the area or do much development. And I even now have read that these same conditions exist, and I'm wondering if you could comment on what the government might be able to do in the way of peaceful development, economic development, to try to discourage people from joining organizations like this, which seems to be, there seems to be a great attraction, at least, in bringing people into these organizations.
Yeah. Quick summary, I told you I have problems.
I see.
I missed most of those.
So I believe the question here has to do with the role that government policy promoting development might play in mitigating some of the problems that you were describing in your lecture. Did I say that correctly?
The mitigation of those problems.
Through
You
development.
said you taught
Through
somewhere.
development.
You said you gave the example of a state where you were, and I didn't catch the name. Did you?
At the time, it was Sardana province.
Sardana province.
That's right. And
okay.
Mubi was the town.
In Mubi.
Mubi.
Yes, in Sardana province. Yes,
Sardana
the former
province.
Sardana province. Yeah. Again, as I hope I try to outline, the leadership, whether we're talking of a religious, a community, an ethnic community, where the leadership is an intelligent leadership and it's not alienated from the people, there isn't too much of a problem. There's conflict, yes, but the conflict is resolved. As in the case of Sardana, I'm very glad you mentioned that. Sardana was a very intelligent leader. If he was a fanatic at all, he kept it well hidden. In terms of renewal of a religion, for instance, as long as that aspect of renewal, that movement towards renewal, that ensuring that there's no marginalization for a community of belief, all that just requires intelligent management and arbitration. I don't know that a country like the United States can intervene in that level of internal management, or should. I don't think so. It is when the conflicts are exacerbated by extremist preachers, and it becomes an issue of regional security that not just the United States, but even the nations in that area who will realize that it's in their interest to resolve and to arbitrate all those conflicts. They become the primary stakeholders and therefore should be the primary interventionists. I don't think that the United States, I keep saying United Nations, well, you type sometimes like the United Nations, should be the primary movers. It should actually act the role of a strong nation, wise nation, and friendly to all sides. Primary intervention, I stress, begins from internal to the immediate region, as been taking place in Somalia, for instance. The forces in Somalia are largely African forces. And for me, that's the way it should be. Asking for help outside, fine. But not primary intervention, that is really what really causes the resentment when former allies become complete antagonists. I hope that I didn't get a full thrust of the question, but I hope that touches on the answer.
Anyone else?
Sorry, I hope no one minds if I insert myself here really quickly. So I actually have a question that I've been wanting to ask. So one thing I've been curious about, or one of the many things I'm curious about in Nigerian politics, is this similar narrative about MEND and groups in the Niger Delta and Boko Haram, right? So when Asari de Kubo and the Niger Delta People's Volunteer Force first emerged, there's all these reports and stories that he had this alliance with the former governor of River State, Peter Odili, right? And then after the 2003 elections, there was a falling out. And then Asari de Kubo becomes an enemy of the state, and now he's no longer an enemy of the state, right? After the 2009 amnesty program, and now he seems to be quite supportive of the current administration. And there's a similar story there with Boko Haram, right? Mohammed Yusuf had this alliance with the former governor of Borno State, Ali Modo Sharif, and then there's a falling out, and there's stories that the former governor ordered his execution, right? So, I mean, it's interesting, this pattern where these armed groups have these alliances with local state actors, the governors in this case, and then there's a falling out, but clearly in the Niger Delta, it didn't explode into a terrorist organization like Boko Haram. So then they do follow very different paths. And I think it's interesting to compare the two, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on these two groups and their similarities and why they seem to now have followed very different trajectories. And I promise I will give the microphone to you next.
I believe that
Okay,
was Megan Turnbull, graduate student
Yes.
in political science. Be careful whom you give the microphone to.
Very sorry about that. Thank you. Thanks.
Sir?
What was the exact question? Sorry, I have to explain. I have a problem with my hearing aid. It doesn't distinguish between accents. And when people ask questions, we move from accent to accent. They finish by the time it's analyzed what is being said. So you must excuse me relying on him.
Can you put it succinctly, Meg?
Yes. So I very briefly was asking what your thoughts are on the similarities and the differences between MEND, or the Niger Delta People's Volunteer Force in the Niger Delta, and the history of Boko Haram. They seem to have similar stories regarding their relationship with the state and the governors, but then they seem to take very different trajectories, paths. And I was curious what your thoughts were. Thank you.
Talking of Sharif, of course.
Yes,
Yes,
in Borno State, yeah.
Yeah. In other words, history is repeating itself. Here is a government now which is supposed to be dedicated to eradicating Boko Haram, supposed to be retrieving from wherever they are 250 schoolgirls who have been abducted by this organization. There is the president of the nation who visits Chad next door, and among his entourage we find this man who's been accused by various, on many levels, and who has a record. The security there, even the Cameroonian government interrogated him at one stage at the beginning of the Boko Haram, accused him of participating, of being responsible for this organization. And then the next thing you know, President Jonathan is in Chad, meeting President Deby, and who is being received in audience with him? Who met Jonathan? Sharif. It is when we cried out, say, what the hell are you doing with Sharif? And say, oh no, he wasn't in my entourage. He happens to be a friend of President Deby, and to my surprise, he was receiving me in Chad. And I asked the question, you mean you are, as president, not capable of saying to Deby, either him or me, I cannot be seen in public with this character. But no, you sit with him in audience, the photograph is there all over the place. How can any nation take us seriously that we really mean to crush Boko Haram or retrieve the girls who've been, the humanity, not just the girls. Boko Haram has been, as you know, on a campaign of kidnapping, killing the men, and taking the women as sex slaves. This is what's been going on. And when you have a situation which is as penetrative, evilly penetrative as that, in an entity over which you preside as chairman or chief, how much more as president of a modern state, you allow yourself to be seen, to be compromised by somebody who's tainted in any way. It becomes very difficult for one to be seen with a Nigerian passport outside. That's the only comment I can make with the thrust of your question.
Is there one final question then?
I am Lina Cuellar. I am from Colombia, South America. And I am wondering, what do you think is the main role of the intellectuals concerning the situation of impunity And do you think if intellectuals can make a change or have an impact on impunity and on violence? Because I also come from a violent country, and I often ask myself if intellectuals should have a more active role on fighting or talking about these kind of situations.
You know, there are many similarities. I'm glad you mentioned Colombia, because many similarities. One is coming from, as I keep stressing, true social inequalities, etc., 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 supplies of food soldiers, but fueled by religious conviction, or shall we say manipulation. The other one, ideologically involved and possibly with certain ethnic tensions, but creating a state within a state, trying to create a government within a government, and succeeding for a number of years. Boko Haram now has been, has really established itself as an independent entity within an enclave. And the danger is that if we're not careful, it's going to liaise. It's already declared itself a caliphate, for instance. If we're not careful, it's going to liaise with other forces in the Middle East and even in Europe. Fortunately for Colombia, I think very few people will be found who say that they approve of, shall we say, because the movement in Colombia has been tainted with drug, with drug trafficking and so on. And very few nations will say, we adopt, we sympathize with drug trafficking. Whereas in the case of Nigeria, you have many nations which actually back Boko Haram because its activities conform to their vision of a unified religious state. And so the results in physical terms are the same. Defiance of the state exists, not contempt for the state as such, for the structure of the state. As in the case of Nigeria, there is absolute contempt for the structure of the state. Unless, of course, it is a state recognized, defined by the constitution, which is known as the Quran. So there are differences and there are similarities, at least in terms of effect. The methodology, the brutal methodology, the engagement of use of forcible recruitment in fighting the state, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, it has to do with the definition of what the state should be. Even when a group says the state should be abolished completely, what they're really saying is our notion of the state is what should exist. And we're willing to fight to the death, sacrifice ourselves, sacrifice our peace, just for that vision, that utopia, which is defined either in a secular form or in a religious form. The result's exactly the same.
Well,
Joseph Kony.
Excuse me. Yeah. She also asked about the role of intellectuals, of Nigerian
intellectuals. Oh, sorry, I missed that completely.
In counteracting this impunity.
Yeah. The intellectuals in Nigeria, in the case of Boko Haram, I think are united. Very few Muslim intellectuals are left, I believe, which espouse the cause of Boko Haram. Even if at the beginning they were a mixture, for instance, of, shall we say, secular ideology, let's say Marxists. There are Marxists, for instance, who mix up this cocktail of secular ideology, of the revolutionary idea, who propagate the revolutionary idea, no matter through whose means. For instance, when we have the Maitatsine in Nigeria, it's a prior violent sect of Islam, which also totally deplored the existence of modernism in contemporary society. And you had intellectuals who called themselves Marxists, who believed that, for instance, the Maitatsine was the prelude to the creation of an egalitarian society. So intellectuals come in many forms, many breeds of intellectuals. But generally, I think today as I'm speaking, over Boko Haram, even whether they call themselves Marxists, they call themselves liberal politicians, liberal ideologists, or they call themselves progressive religionists, I think all the intellectuals are coming out and speaking against this phenomenon. Most of those who go regularly to the Bring Back the Girls campaign outside the seat of government are intellectuals. There's a unanimity between the intellectual class and the general, the workers' class, if you like, the working class, the proletariat, or the rural, the farming community. The problem which intellectuals have, and which perhaps should be urged on them, is to look out, to be on the lookout for what comes after. You can have alliances, short-term alliances, but you must not allow that to give joy and to give power, to allow reactionary power to consolidate itself simply because there's a common cause. It's not a dilemma as far as I'm concerned. It's possible, I think, to walk and chew gum at the same time, we can ally at this moment, but we should also, as intellectuals, be conscious of the fact that we are living under a very corrupt government. And that government should not be allowed to profit by the recognition of a common enemy, which must be defeated. It's a very delicate line to draw, but I think that is why intellectuals call themselves intellectuals.
Thank you. Thanks to our guests. Thanks to you for your patience. It's been a good evening. We're adjourned.